Every week, it seems like there is a new headline telling us how to achieve optimal health and wellness. Lower your cholesterol to avoid dying from heart disease, or take a GLP-1 antagonist to lose weight, or eat like this to avoid weight gain during perimenopause. Unfortunately, this sensational approach of headlines to sharing research study outcomes doesn't help us figure out whether or not the information from the study and even in the article that we're reading is actually applicable to us as an individual. I've talked before about how nutrition and other health advice needs to be personalized, and this is true even when the suggestion comes from scientific research. So let's talk about how a research study actually works and what the information can and cannot tell us. And then we're going to get into what makes it so tricky to determine whether or not the results of a research study are actually applicable to any one of us. My name is Stephanie Dunn. I'm a registered dietitian and the founder of Feed Your Intention. I guide women to nourish their wellness and reclaim their wholeness. And today we're going to dive deep into research studies and how to use them as it relates to personalizing our own nutrition for our health journey. So let's talk about the basic structure when it comes to research. The first thing that happens is a research question is asked. That is basically what the study is trying to figure out. And a hypothesis is set. That hypothesis is what the researchers think the outcome is going to be from the study itself. Then a study design is determined, and there are lots of factors that go into deciding what the study design should look like, and we're going to talk about the two most common options in just a little bit. Now, the study is then performed, and out of that comes a bunch of data. And the researchers do a statistical analysis on the data. They do that analysis both on the input data, basically on the people who were part of the study, and on the outcomes experienced by those people. The people on whom the study is performed or from whom the observations are made are called the population of the study. Now, once they've done that statistical analysis on the outcomes of the study, conclusions are then drawn about the hypothesis that was made at the beginning. So let me give you a very specific example to start off with, because this will really help solidify what I mean by saying that these conclusions are drawn from the study as it is done. So in this particular design that we're going to talk about, the question was whether or not a medication improves cardiovascular disease outcomes by raising HDL. In other words, a specific pharmaceutical was used that is known to raise HDL levels, and they wanted to know whether or not that would result in a change to the cardiovascular disease outcomes experienced. So in this particular research study, let's say they recruited two groups of people. So this is going to be what we call an intervention study, okay? So they recruit two groups of people, and these two groups of people are essentially equivalent to each other. This helps to reduce the possibility that there is some other factor influencing the outcome of the study. So in this particular case, both groups would have had an equivalent HDL level at the beginning of the study, okay? So one of these two groups is going to be what we call the control group, and the other group is going to be called the intervention group. So now in the control group, they are going to be given what is called a placebo. A placebo is essentially something that looks, tastes, and smells exactly like the medication that is being given to the intervention group, but it is inert, meaning it has no impact in the body at all. The intervention group is the one being given the actual medication that is being studied. And it's really important that these two pills that are being given look exactly the same because we don't want either group to know whether or not they are in the control group and receiving the placebo, the thing that shouldn't have any impact, or if they're in the intervention group and actually receiving the medication that's being studied. So some time passes, however long it is it's being that the time is set for based on the study design. And then after that time period, the researchers confirm that the intervention group ultimately has a higher HDL level than the control group. Because remember, we started with equivalent levels of HDL. We've gone through the intervention through the time that has passed. And now we're going to confirm, first of all, that the intervention group that the medication actually did raise their HDL levels, and that the control group did not see the same increase in HDL levels. Now we're going to check, we being the researchers, now the researchers are going to check how many cardiovascular events occurred within each group. How many people had a heart attack? How many people had a stroke? How many people had angina? How many people died from a cardiovascular disease? And they're going to ask, are these two numbers, the numbers being how many cardiovascular disease events happened, are they statistically equivalent? Are they the same? And once they have done that statistical analysis, then they'll be able to determine whether or not raising HDL levels through a pharmaceutical specifically helps to lower the number of cardiovascular disease events that a person will experience. Or said more accurately, how likely it is that the number will be reduced. So, why may this not be true even if these numbers are showing a statistical difference between the cardiovascular events? Well, I'm going to use the data from this review study that I've linked at the bottom of this slide. So a review study means that rather than the researchers actually performing these interventions themselves, they actually collect data from a bunch of different studies that did this type of intervention. They compile all of that data and then they check to see what did the studies show, all 19 of these studies, as it relates to an intervention to raise HDL and the ultimate outcome of cardiovascular disease events. So these researchers wanted to know, based on these 19 studies, were the number of cardiovascular events statistically the same? Meaning, is a person just as likely to experience a cardiovascular event with lower HDL as with pharmaceutical-induced higher HDL? Because if the answer is yes, then we don't have a reason to use medicine to raise someone's HDL because it's not going to change whether or not they experience a cardiovascular event. So, were they statistically the same is the question that these researchers wanted to answer based on these 19 studies. And what they found is that the answer was yes. Statistically, just as many people experienced a heart attack or a stroke or angina in the group with the lower HDL as in the group with the HDL that was raised using medication. So the ultimate conclusion that was drawn from this is that higher HDL levels do not reduce the risk of experiencing a cardiovascular event. Okay, that is what they ultimately decided based on these types of studies. Now, because of studies like these, Canada and Europe have gotten rid of recommended HDL levels. Now, they do use HDL in other calculations that they use as it relates to cardiovascular risk, but as it relates to a target specifically related to HDL, Canada and Europe have gotten rid of their targets. And the reasoning seems to make sense, right? Like if higher HDL levels don't prevent the outcomes that we're trying to prevent, then there's no reason to recommend higher HDL levels. But is this actually true based on what was in the studies themselves? So we're going to break this down just a little bit. So first, let's start with the current recommendation for HDL levels for women. Now, this is in the US because, as I mentioned, Europe and Canada no longer have targets for HDL cholesterol. So for women in the US, the recommended HDL target is greater than 50 milligrams per deciliter. So these are the units that we use in the United States. In Canada and Europe, that would be equivalent to greater than 1.3 millimoles per liter. This is the recommended target for women. But the starting HDL levels with both groups, right, because they have equivalent HDL levels, the starting levels at the beginning of the study for both groups was between 33 and 86 milligrams per deciliter, meaning between 0.5 and 2.22 millimoles per liter. And in 4 of the studies, the starting average was greater than 50 milligrams per deciliter. So what that means is that some of these 19 studies, we already at the start have an HDL level that is above the target. Okay, so we're not talking about 2 groups who all have HDL below the recommended target level. We're talking about groups of which some, 4 specifically out of these, already are above the target value or the target level of HDL before the study ever even begins. Now, after the intervention, the HDL levels of the intervention group had increased. We know this, but they increased by between 1 and 24 milligrams per deciliter. So that is between 0.03 and 0.62 millimoles per liter. So on average, because I actually did go through and average them out, it was an average increase of about 10 milligrams per deciliter, right? And this does sound significant. The 10 does. Increasing something by 1 does not sound significant at all. But an average of 10 actually does sort of sound significant. However, there's another however here. In 11 of these 19 studies, the ending average of the higher HDL group was still less than 50 milligrams per deciliter. Still. So even after the intervention, they still have not hit the target level that we've said we're looking for, that we have said reduces the risk of cardiovascular events in women specifically. They still haven't hit it. So does it actually mean that a higher HDL level is not protecting you from cardiovascular events? We don't really know. Because all these studies are saying is that if you increase someone's HDL by about 10 milligrams per deciliter, but it's still less than the target that we've said we want, which is 50, their risk of cardiovascular events is the same as if it wasn't increased. And that sort of makes sense to me, right? Because we still haven't hit the threshold in over half of the studies where we have said that the cardiovascular events will go down because we now have a protective level of HDL. So why do you care about all of this? Well, these studies did what they were intended to do, which is to check if we raise HDL. Remember, there was never a target put in there, like if we raise it above 50, if we raise it by 20 milligrams per deciliter, right? All the question asked was, if we pharmaceutically raise these HDL numbers, will it have an impact on the number of cardiovascular events experienced? And the answer was no, it won't. Right? So the studies did what they intended to do. These were good studies, but they did not tell us what the impact would be if the HDL was below the target at the start of the study and then above the target at the end of the study. Now, for a couple of them, that was true, but across the board, that was not true. We don't have 19 studies where we started below and ended above the threshold number. It also does not tell us what the impact would be if the person raised their HDL cholesterol through diet and lifestyle versus with the medication, or even with both, because surely there are other impacts that could be realized that contribute to those cardiovascular events rather than just the HDL number. And the last thing it doesn't tell us is what would happen if all of the participants were women in the menopause transition, right? Because they looked at a certain population, and I don't know what the population is, but towards the end of this video, we're going to talk about why population matters. But we don't know whether or not raising HDL levels through a pharmaceutical of some sort actually protects women in menopause or in the menopause transition from experiencing cardiovascular events. So if you are a woman who is going through this hormonal transition, the information in these studies might or might not apply to you. So I want to say again, these research studies were well designed and peer-reviewed before being published. That means they are good research. They were performed in a way that is considered scientifically sound. But they were looked at from a research perspective, not from the perspective of you and the data that your body and your life bring to the table. So as part of this discussion, I mentioned that the results were statistically significant, right? That is what research is constantly trying to check. Is this statistically significant? But what does that actually mean? Well, this really matters because nutrition headlines and trends like to grab onto things that have been shown to have a significant impact. I hope you found the information in this video helpful. If it felt like it ended kind of abruptly, that's because when I recorded these videos, they were originally one long video and I decided that that was too much, so I cut them up into smaller videos. I hope you'll check out the other videos in this series so that you can have a really complete picture about the various aspects of nutrition research and how to read them, plus how to read the headlines that come from that research to know whether or not the information is applicable to you. So please check out the other videos in this series. And in the meantime, I wish you wellness and wholeness.